video, I'm going to be reviewing this book here called The Interbrain, How Unconscious Connections Influence Human Behaviour and Relationships. And this book is written by a guy called Digby Tantam. He's a psychiatrist. So it says here, on the back, that Digby Tantam explores the groundbreaking theory of the interbrain, the idea that human beings are endlessly connected by continuous interplay of non-verbal communication of which we are unaware. Considering social smiles and the way emotions can spread from one person to another, he explores the research that shows how our brains are linked and draws out the implications of the interbrain for understanding of empathy, social communication, psychology and group behaviour. Okay, so I just want to kind of tease out some of the most important aspects of the book that appeal to me the most. I have to say that it was quite hard to read this book, and it wasn't my best book because it was part popular science, part kind of monograph. So it's kind of like, it was a little bit clunky to read because you had like footnotes at the bottom of each page, which I found quite distracting, but I had to read them because I can't really ignore things, so that kind of like meant it was a little bit difficult to read. And I also felt that he could have summarised it better in a far shorter book because I felt it was a little bit repetitive in places, but I still came away nonetheless with some insights. The main sort of like insight from the book really is the distinction that he draws between the interbrain, which is kind of like this innate kind of reflexive connection that most people, non-autistic people, are kind of born with, and that is kind of very much reflexive and is built around a sort of he sort of uses the analogy almost like of an internet, of like brains being wirelessly connected to one another, and via kind of mimicry and mirroring and emotional contagion. And theory of mind is a separate process that builds upon the foundation of the interbrain, and that develops more slowly in like non-autistic people between the age of about 2 and 4, but it develops out of this already there emotional rapport, emotional reciprocity between people. But and that theory of mind though is more kind of cerebral, it's more intellectual, and it comes more out of narrative and language, and it's more conscious and more conscious. So then obviously if you don't really have a strongly formed interbrain connection, or only a very weak interbrain connection, then it's going to be a lot harder then to build the theory of mind. It's not impossible, but it's going to take a lot longer, and it's going to be a lot harder, and you're going to have to kind of it's going to just take a lot longer because you don't already have that embedded connection there, because theory of mind comes more out of language. Interestingly, theory of mind is very much originally comes out of a visual sense, which I thought was quite interesting because we talk about like how people see things differently from one another, and we use seeing inverted commas, like sort of like metaphorically seeing things differently, but actually it originally derives from the fact that people can determine from the axis of another person's gaze what objects are in their visual field. So this visual perspective taking, the very real concrete use of a visual sense to work out what someone else is looking at, is actually the basis of the developmental theory of mind. So it comes out of that interbrain connection, that kind of innate kind of ability that people have to follow another person's gaze, and from that they develop the ability to perspective take, and out of that comes the theory of mind, at least in non-autistics. And I thought that was interesting because I do really struggle with visual perspective taking and understand, and I'm quite kind of weak on a kind of visual understanding of information in that respect. So I thought that was interesting. But also, of course, less literally, it involves having different thoughts about the same observations. So theory of mind comes out of the development of narrative, ability, and it's arrived at through the practice and conversations, and this then leads to the child having a mind, which then becomes a prerequisite for having a theory of mind. So the first thing is that the child then develops an awareness of their own mind, and they develop self-awareness and a development of their own understanding of their own world and their own emotions, and out of that they can then understand other people's world and other people's emotions. He says that having self-awareness is probably dependent on having a language-like system of communication in which narratives or stories can be constructed, which I thought was interesting. So theory of mind develops out of shared or joint attention, and shared or joint attention builds on the original gaze reflexes that babies are born with. So looking at someone else's eyes when that other person looking at them and following their gaze, out of that comes the shared or joint attention, and theory of mind built on that comes out of that. So theory of mind is more the interbrain connection is more emotional based, and that's where effective empathy comes from. The kind of innate, instinctive kind of emotional resonance that people have with one another comes out of the interbrain connection, whereas theory of mind is more cognitive, more cerebral, more mind-based, and so that's why we have, as another name for theory of mind, is often also called cognitive empathy. And he talks about how so theory of mind is more like the explicit rules, which is kind of which, like I say, is built on the interbrain connection. So explicit rules is to do with our narratives about how to treat other people. Our narratives about how to treat other people incline us to fairness or to law. It's like the theory of mind is all to do with trying to understand other people's perspectives in order to kind of come out with kind of rules to do with around like compromise and cooperation, and it's to do with like putting yourself in other people's shoes via narrative and stories and things about how people work. So it's very, very much based around language. And he talks about how autism in people with specific intellectual disability is actually two disorders. So it's autism plus a specific language impairment. And that might have kind of confused the early studies in theory of mind, because historically theory of mind is said to be lacking. It's said to be the main deficit in autism. And obviously historically autism was conceptualised as being a very narrow disorder to do with nearly always associated with an intellectual disability and a speech and language impairment. And if theory of mind is very much connected to language and narrative, and obviously someone who doesn't have language or only has very minimal language is very likely going to have a deficit in theory of mind. This isn't just autistic people, it's even those people who might not, like for example, people like deaf people who, before they've developed like a signing system, can also struggle with theory of mind as well. So theory of mind impairment is very easily demonstrated in this group, but not necessarily in people whose language has developed more normally, who do not consistently fail theory of mind tasks. So failure on theory of mind tasks is particularly associated with pragmatic errors, which cause impairment in narrative, so in telling and following stories, and that's irrespective of autism. And I thought that was quite interesting because I obviously, as an autistic person, I struggle with theory of mind. I don't lack it completely, in a sense that, I understand on a very basic level that I'm separate to other people and so on. But, so on a very basic level, I understand that. And I think most autistic people who are intellectually advanced, if you will, on a sort of verbal level, at least have some basic understanding. I think where you find really severe lacks in theory of mind is usually in autistics with an associated intellectual disability. But for autistics, you have like language abilities that, at least on the surface level, are advanced, I think do have a basic theory of mind. So it's not the case that it's like we lack it completely. I think it's more that we just really struggle to kind of really understand the kind of complexities of other people, and obviously we really struggle to understand in real time what someone else is thinking or feeling, and then to use that information to kind of form relationships. And that's because we often have like a very much reduced interbrain connection. Our bandwidth, if you like, is very narrow, so we're not really connected to other people's brains in a way that non-autistics are, because we're not so intuitively connected to other people's brains on that kind of like affective level. This then can be a lot harder for us to develop that theory of mind. But obviously this varies between different autistics. Some people have less fear of mind, other autistics might have slightly more fear of mind, because autism isn't like one thing. So in my case, yeah, I do really struggle with theory of mind. I don't lack it completely, but I would say I have a very rudimentary, very primitive, very small awareness of other people, but it's very cerebral, and it's something that it's not something I can really understand on a very deep level. It's very shallow, it's very surface, and it's something I've had to kind of, it's not innate for me. And I do really struggle historically with kind of like understanding of plots and stories, and I struggled a lot with comprehension at school. And so although I do have good language, at least on the surface my language ability is advanced, I do still historically have struggled in this sort of like more pragmatic stuff, and I've taken things literally and struggled to understand other people's perspectives, and I struggle to understand and follow plots. And I still struggle with this. It's just that it's not quite as obvious as when I was a kid. But yeah, so I thought that was interesting. Okay, so I'm going to move on to video number 2 now.